Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into, well, a pretty complex topic, the limits of modern liberalism.
Yeah, it's a big one.
So I got this draft dissertation from one of you listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And it really kind of takes aim at liberalism, saying that it might not be the best way to handle the really divided world that we're all living in.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting stuff.
It is. And it also proposes a possible alternative, which is this McIntyrean modus vivendi.
Yeah.
So, we're going to explore some, I'd say, pretty outside-the-box ideas, some from the left and some from the right. So,
looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too. It should be fun. So the dissertation really jumps right in, right from the start. It makes the argument that liberalism, in its attempt to be neutral, actually ends up favoring a specific worldview, which it argues is oftentimes a progressive one.
Right, yeah.
And this leads to what the dissertation calls a political comprehensive collapse, meaning that the system has a really hard time accommodating people with strong, non-liberal beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, the dissertation doesn't mince words at all, does it?
Not at all, no. So how would you say this plays out in the real world?
Well, I mean, just look around at, especially North America, politically. It's like everyone's just sorting themselves into these ideological tribes,
right?
Online and geographically.
Yeah, and it's like that old saying, birds of a feather flock together.
Right.
But it's like now is happening with our political beliefs.
Right.
And, social media doesn't help. It just makes it worse.
Yeah.
With all these algorithms designed to keep us in these echo chambers.
Yeah.
So all we see is the stuff that we already agree with.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost impossible to break out of that, isn't it?
And it's really hard to have a discussion with somebody when you only see one side of the argument.
Exactly. And I think this is where that concept of effective polarization comes in that the dissertation talks about. It's not just disagreeing on policy anymore. It's actually just genuinely disliking the other side.
Right.
Which makes compromise basically impossible.
It makes any kind of civil discussion or debate almost impossible.
Right.
You see it all the time online.
Yeah.
Especially this dimensionality reduction, where complex issues get boiled down to these super simplistic binary choices.
Oh yeah, totally. It's like you're either with us or against us.
Right. Exactly.
There's no nuance, no middle ground.
And the dissertation uses the example of the debate around gender identity among minors.
Oh yeah, that's a perfect example, isn't it?
Which is really relevant, and it's playing out right now across the country. In some states, you have these policies being put into place that restrict, gender-affirming care, while other states are expanding, rights for transgender youth.
Yeah.
And it just creates this huge chasm with, very little room for any kind of middle ground.
Right.
So is that what the dissertation is arguing? That liberalism just isn't equipped to handle these kinds of really deep divisions?
That's a big part of it. Yeah. It's saying that liberalism, with its emphasis on individual rights and, trying to find this neutral common ground, it's just not working when you have these really fundamental clashes in, values.
Okay.
So it puts forward this idea of a McIntyrean modus vivendi as a potential alternative.
Right.
And that's a mouthful, I know. But basically, instead of trying to find this grand unifying theory of justice, a modus vivendi focuses on finding a way for people to coexist peacefully, even though they may have some fundamental disagreements.
Okay, so it's not about forcing everyone to agree. It's about finding a way to live together respectfully.
Exactly.
Even with these fundamental differences.
Yeah. And the dissertation draws heavily on the work of Alistair McIntyre, who's a philosopher, who argues for this devolutionary modus vivendi.
So what does that mean? Devolutionary.
So imagine shifting power away from the national level to smaller subnational units, like think states or provinces, or even indigenous nations, giving them more autonomy to govern themselves based on their own values.
So it's almost like a radical departure from that one-size-fits-all approach of traditional liberalism.
Yeah, it definitely is.
But, are there any safeguards, built into this?
Well, the dissertation does outline 3 limiting conditions that are really important. The first is democratic participation within those units.
Okay.
So it's not about just giving power to a small group of elites.
Right.
The second is that there needs to be representation at higher levels of government, so like a federal system.
Okay.
And they call this the proxy condition.
Okay.
And the third is that there needs to be at least a basic standard of welfare for all citizens.
Okay, so preventing tyranny of the majority and making sure that everyone's basic needs are met.
Exactly.
Even as you allow for more local control.
Right.
But wouldn't this lead to even more fragmentation and division?
That's a really important question.
Yeah.
And to understand how the dissertation answers that, we need to dig into the specific demands of both right and left-leaning non-liberals.
Okay.
It's a surprisingly diverse group, actually.
So let's dive in. Who are some of these key players, and what are they proposing?
Let's do it. Okay, so let's start with some of the right-leaning non-liberals. Thinkers like Patrick Demeen and Adrian Vermeule.
Right.
They really take aim at what they see as some of liberalism's core flaws.
Deneen's big on how liberalism has kind of like homogenized our culture.
Yeah.
Right? Like he wants to get back to that common good conservatism
Yeah.
rooted in those local traditions,
Yeah.
values. What about Vermeule? Where's he coming from?
Vermeule's coming at it more from like a legal perspective. So he's really pushing for this common good constitutionalism, which is basically trying to replace that liberal neutrality with a legal framework that's more assertive and more morally grounded.
So is he drawing on anything specific?
Yeah.
Like any particular tradition?
He draws a lot on Catholic thought.
Interesting. So they're both saying, hey, this whole neutrality thing, it isn't working.
Yeah.
They want a system that actually like actively promotes a certain vision of the good.
Right. They want something that's more substantive, more rooted in something beyond just individual rights.
Do they agree on how to get there?
Not necessarily. I mean, Deneen is all about bottom-up change, localism, grassroots movements.
So kind of building something new from the ground up based on those shared values, which really does resonate with this whole devolutionary aspect of the modus vivendi, right?
Exactly. But Vermeule is more top-down. He argues for change from within the institutions we already have.
Interesting. So one is kind of building something new, and the other is like repurposing what we've already got.
Exactly.
Big difference in approach.
Huge. And the dissertation points out that this tension between like the grassroots and the institutional strategies would be a major challenge if we were ever going to try to implement a McIntyrean modus vivendi.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got the right non-liberal perspective. What about the left? I imagine they have some pretty different critiques of liberalism.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, there's some overlap for sure, but they have distinct priorities. So the dissertation focuses on the left, non-liberals, who are really skeptical of endless economic growth.
Okay, so we're talking about the degrowth movement, the folks who are advocating for alternative economic models.
Exactly. And they often draw inspiration from indigenous practices.
So it's not just about tweaking capitalism, it's about really questioning its core assumptions.
Yeah, it's a much more fundamental critique.
Okay, so who are some of the thinkers that are driving this?
Well, the dissertation mentions authors like Richard Heinberg, who's written a ton about the limits of growth, on a finite planet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. But I mean, that's got to be a tough sell for a lot of people. We're pretty attached to our comforts, What would a degrowth economy even look like in practice? How would it work?
Well, Heinberg and others talk about shifting away from fossil fuels, localizing production and consumption, really prioritizing essential needs over just rampant consumerism.
So less about having it all and more about having what matters.
Yeah, quality over quantity, for sure.
It sounds like a pretty major lifestyle shift, though.
It would be a huge shift, but the dissertation connects this to the modus vivendi, right?
Yeah, how so?
The idea is that devolution would allow for experimentation with these alternative economic models at the local level, so different communities could try different approaches.
And see what works. It's like instead of a top-down, one-size-fits-all approach, you have all these little laboratories of democracy for economic systems.
Exactly. Trial and error, adaptation. It's a much more dynamic model, and this is where indigenous perspectives.
Yeah, Coulthard's argument is that just recognizing indigenous rights within the existing system isn't enough, right? Like he wants a much deeper shift in those power relations.
Right. He's talking about real self-determination, sovereignty, challenging the state's authority over indigenous lands and resources.
Okay.
And the modus vivendi, with that focus on devolution, could potentially offer a pathway for indigenous communities to have more control over their destinies.
So they'd be able to govern themselves according to their own laws and traditions, manage their own resources.
Exactly.
What about the economic side of things, though?
Well, Coulthard talks about this idea of grounded normativity, meaning that indigenous conceptions of the good are rooted in their relationships to their specific lands and territories.
So their values are like intertwined with the places they inhabit. It's not just some abstract economic system. It's a way of life that's connected to the environment.
Exactly. And Coulthard argues that this is fundamentally at odds with capitalism, with that drive for endless accumulation and profit. He sees traditional indigenous practices as offering potential models for a more sustainable and equitable way of life.
So practices that emphasize things like reciprocity, balance, respect for the natural world.
Yeah.
It's about learning from indigenous knowledge.
And incorporating it into our economic systems.
Yeah. I mean, the dissertation is making a clear connection here, right? It's not about romanticizing the past. It's about recognizing that there's wisdom in these alternative ways of being in the world.
Yeah.
Especially as we face these challenges like climate change.
Exactly. And as we try to build a more just and sustainable future.
Okay. So we've got these fascinating ideas from both the right and left-leaning non-liberals.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like they agree on the problems with traditional liberalism.
Yeah, for the most part.
But have very different visions for what should come next.
Right.
So what are some of those concrete demands? What are they bringing to the table?
Well, the dissertation lays out some pretty specific asks. On the right, you have these calls for greater control over education and family policy.
So like pushing back against the state, getting involved in areas they think should be left to parents.
Yeah, exactly. They see it as protecting the family from, what they view as a liberal agenda.
Giving them more say in shaping their kids' values and beliefs.
Right. And on the left, you have demands for greater economic and ethnic sovereignty, particularly for indigenous communities.
So what would that look like in practice?
Well, things like control over resources, the right to regulate industry on their lands, even the ability to, limit participation in some cultural practices to members of their group.
Okay, that's getting into some tricky territory. Some of those demands could be really controversial. I mean, how do you even start to reconcile those different visions, within this whole modus vivendi framework?
Yeah, it wouldn't be easy, that's for sure. The dissertation acknowledges that there would be tension, potential for conflict. But the point is that it's not about eliminating disagreements altogether.
Right.
It's about managing those differences.
Peacefully.
Yeah, finding a way to make it productive.
So creating a system where different groups can coexist, pursue their own vision of the good, even if they clash.
Right. And the argument is that this devolutionary model could actually reduce political polarization.
Okay, how so?
Because instead of these huge battles at the national level, you'd have these smaller, more homogenous units where folks can live according to their own beliefs.
So it's almost like a political ecosystem with different habitats for different species.
Yeah, I like that.
But what about inequality? Would this just lead to the richer, more powerful groups, getting even more entrenched?
That's a really valid concern. And this is where those limiting conditions come back in.
Right. The democratic participation, representation at higher levels of government, and that basic standard of welfare.
Exactly. Those safeguards are really important to prevent things from going too far.
So it's about creating boundaries, even as you allow for more autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can govern yourselves, but within these limits.
Yeah, exactly. And the dissertation talks about ideological time-out sorting.
Time-out sorting.
It's this idea that people will choose to live in places that align with their values,
So if you're conservative, you might move to a more conservative state. And if you're progressive, you might seek out a more liberal area.
Exactly. It's like choosing your neighborhood, but based on politics.
Yeah.
And it could reduce those national level conflicts because you have more self-sorting.
But wouldn't that just lead to more geographic and social segregation? What about people who can't afford to move? Or people who have deep roots in a place that's, become ideologically myth-aligned?
Those are big questions. And the dissertation recognizes that this would require a strong federal government, to enforce those limiting conditions.
Okay, so it's not a completely hands-off approach. The federal government still plays a role.
Definitely. It's a delicate balance.
Between local autonomy and protecting basic rights.
Right.
Let's be real, though. Some of these demands from these non-liberal groups, they're pretty radical.
Right.
Like allowing states or communities to have so much control over education or to restrict economic activity or even discriminate based on ethnicity. I mean, that's a hard sell.
It is. The dissertation doesn't shy away from the controversy. But it argues we need to understand those demands in the context of these larger goals, giving communities more power to shape their own destinies.
But how do you stop it from just becoming a bunch of mini tyrannies?
Yeah.
Where individual rights are just kind of tossed aside?
That's the million-dollar question. And the dissertation is very clear that this wouldn't be some static system. You'd need constant dialogue, negotiation, a willingness to compromise.
Some mechanisms for dealing with conflicts.
Exactly. And for making sure the system stays fair.
It sounds messy.
Oh, incredibly messy, but also kind of hopeful?
Yeah, I see that. Like a potential way out of all this gridlock.
Yeah, that's the hope. The dissertation doesn't pretend it's some perfect solution, but it suggests this McIntyrean modus vivendi could be a more realistic path forward than trying to force everyone into one big system.
It's a lot to think about. We've gone from the limits of liberalism to these radical proposals from both the left and the right. This dissertation has really given us a lot to chew on.
It's a call to look beyond those simple labels, and to engage with how complex the world really is.
It reminds us that the future is not set in stone. We have choices about how we shape our political systems, our communities. So I guess the question for all of us is, if peaceful coexistence means finding ways to live with those deep differences, is a modus vivendi the best path forward? And what role will you play in shaping that future?
Yeah, they're not easy questions, but they're the right ones to be asking.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep those questions coming and keep the conversation going.